The crowd roared with laughter when the gavel slammed at $90. They saw a burnt, warped block of useless iron dragged from a gutted hotel. Arthur saw $90 he couldn't afford to lose. But the joke died that night, the second the dial finally clicked. The July heat radiating off the asphalt felt like a physical weight pressing down on the crowd. It was the kind of heat that made the air shimmer above the hoods of pickup trucks and baked the smell of spilled diesel and stale sweat into the pavement. In the center of the dusty lot, Barnes, an auctioneer with a voice like a rusted blender, was rapidly liquidating the charred bones of the Piedmont Hotel. Arthur stood near the back, a battered thermos in one hand and a thin roll of $20 bills shoved deep into his front pocket. He wasn't a professional liquidator. He wasn't a wealthy antique dealer hunting for mid-century modern furniture. Arthur ran a failing plumbing and hardware supply store on the edge of town, a business he'd inherited from his father, along with a mountain of unserviceable debt. He had come to the auction hoping to score a few pallets of salvaged copper piping or brass fixtures he could flip to scrape together next month's mortgage payment. Instead, he had watched the big salvage companies from the city buy up everything of value in the first hour. Now they were down to the dregs. A forklift belched black smoke as it lumbered to the center of the crowd. The forks tilted, dropping a massive soot-blackened cube onto the concrete with a heavy, unceremonious thud. The ground actually vibrated beneath Arthur's worn work boots. "All right, boys, look alive," Barnes barked into a microphone that fed into a crackling PA system. "We got the main office safe, old Mosler make, heavy cast iron. As you can see, she took a beating when the roof collapsed in the fire." It was a generous description. The safe was an atrocity. The original black enamel was blistered and flaking away like dead skin. The heavy brass dial was warped, fused to the door by the intense heat of the blaze. The hinges sagged. A thick layer of white ash and dried fire-retardant foam clung to the bottom corners. It looked less like a security box and more like a tombstone that had been struck by lightning. "Management lost the combination 10 years ago," Barnes continued, wiping a dirty rag across his forehead. "Also, nobody knows what's inside. Could be $1 million. Could be a stack of unpaid bar tabs from 1985. It's a mystery box, gentlemen. Who'll start me at 500? A collective groan rippled through the crowd. Men in baseball caps and mirrored sunglasses crossed their arms. 500? You're out of your mind, Barnes, someone yelled from the front. You'd have to pay me 100 just to haul that scrap away. Barnes didn't miss a beat. 300, 200, give me 100. Who wants a heavy-duty safe for $100? Silence. The men around Arthur began to murmur to each other, losing interest, checking their phones. A few turned to walk back to their trucks. Arthur looked at the safe. It was useless. It was a block of iron that would require a specialized rig just to move. But there was something about the utter finality of its locked door. A desperate, irrational thought clawed its way up the back of his throat. What if? He shoved his hand into his pocket. His fingers brushed the rough paper of his last $100. If he went home empty-handed, the bank would begin foreclosure proceedings by Tuesday. $90 wasn't going to save his store. $90 wasn't going to fix the hole in his roof or pay the electric bill. It was already gone. $50, Barnes pleaded, his rapid-fire delivery slowing to a pathetic crawl. Come on, scrap metal weight alone. 60, a voice called out. Arthur turned. It was Dean, a local pawn shop owner who wore too much cologne and loved watching people squirm. Dean wasn't buying it to open it. He was buying it to melt it down, and he was grinning right at Arthur, knowing Arthur had been eyeing the metal all morning. Arthur felt a sudden, hot spike of defiance. 70, Dean chuckled, a wet, phlegmy sound. 80. 90, Arthur said, his voice cracking slightly. The word hung in the humid air. Dean threw his hands up in a theatrical gesture of surrender. All yours, buddy. Hope you brought a crane. 90 going once, Barnes said rapidly, eager to move on. Twice, sold. The wooden gavel hit the podium with a sharp crack. The crowd erupted. It wasn't a cheer, it was a chorus of genuine, mocking laughter. Men clapped each other on the back, pointing at Arthur. "Have fun with your new boat anchor, Artie," Dean shouted over the noise. Arthur didn't look at them. He walked forward, peeling 4 20s and a 10 from his pocket, handing them to Barnes's clerk. He walked up to the safe. Up close, it smelled sharply of ozone, burnt plastic, and wet ash. He placed a hand on the blistered iron. It was still warm from sitting in the sun. Loading it took an hour. He had to bribe the forklift operator with his last $10 bill to hoist the monstrosity into the bed of his 15-year-old pickup. The truck's rear suspension screamed in protest, the bumper dipping dangerously close to the asphalt. As Arthur climbed into the driver's seat and turned the key, he caught Dean's reflection in the rearview mirror, still shaking his head, still laughing. Arthur put the truck in gear and pulled out of the lot. He didn't turn on the radio. He just listened to the heavy shifting weight in the back, grinding against the truck bed with every pothole. He had bought a burnt, sealed box of garbage. The realization settled in his gut like a swallowed stone. His garage was a cavern of organized failure. Shelves lined the walls, stacked high with unsold inventory. Boxes of brass fittings, coils of PEX tubing, dusty ceiling fans still in their cardboard packaging. A single, flickering fluorescent tube cast a sickly, pallid light over the concrete floor. It was past 10 o'clock. Outside, the crickets were screaming in the overgrown grass of his backyard. Inside, the air was thick, heavy, and silent. Arthur stood over the Mosler safe. He had managed to drag it off the tailgate using a pair of heavy-duty ratcheting tie-downs and a plywood ramp, nearly crushing his left foot in the process. Now, it sat in the center of the garage, an ugly, immovable blemish. He pulled up a milk crate, sat down, and stared at the dial. He reached out and tried to turn it. The brass grated against the iron, moving barely a millimeter before stopping with a harsh, metallic grind. The internal tumblers had melted and fused. The fire hadn't just warped the exterior, it had essentially soared the locking mechanism into a solid block. Manipulation was impossible. Locksmithing was off the table. This required violence. Arthur stood up and walked to his heavy steel workbench. He pulled on a pair of thick leather welding gloves, grabbed a Makita angle grinder, and slapped in a fresh, diamond-tipped cut-off wheel. He slung a pair of scratched safety goggles over his eyes and grabbed a heavy crowbar. He approached the safe, feeling a strange tightening in his chest. It was the same feeling he got when he looked at his ledger, a mix of dread and absolute necessity. He plugged in the grinder. The motor whined to life, a high-pitched scream that shattered the quiet of the garage. He brought the spinning disc down onto the top hinge. A geyser of bright orange sparks erupted, bouncing off his leather apron and skittering across the concrete floor. The smell of burning steel instantly filled the narrow space, acrid and sharp. Arthur leaned his weight into the tool. The grinder bit into the cast iron, screaming as the diamond edge chewed through the old metal. 10 minutes passed. His arms began to tremble from the intense vibration. He released the trigger, letting the wheel spin down. A deep, glowing trench had been carved into the top hinge, but the metal was incredibly thick. He wiped a streak of dirty sweat from his forehead with the back of his glove, leaving a smear of black grease across his skin. He switched to his power drill. He fitted a titanium-coated bit into the chuck, sprayed a heavy dose of cutting oil onto the bottom corner of the door, and began to drill. He was aiming for the locking bolts, hoping to hollow out the cavity holding them in place. The drill bit caught. The sudden torque violently wrenched the heavy tool, snapping Arthur's wrist backward. "Son of a bitch!" he shouted, dropping the drill. It clattered against the concrete. He ripped off his right glove. His knuckles were scraped raw, a bead of dark blood welling up where the skin had caught on a jagged edge of blistered paint. He stared at his trembling hand. He was exhausted. His back ached. His lungs burned from the metallic dust in the air, and his bank account was practically zero. He looked at the safe. It sat there, completely indifferent to his suffering. It was just a box. It didn't hold salvation. It probably held melted plastic key cards and charred guest ledgers. Dean was right. The auctioneer was right. He was a fool. Arthur walked over to a mini fridge in the corner, pulled out a lukewarm bottle of water, and pressed it against the back of his neck. He closed his eyes. If he walked away now, he could go inside, take a hot shower, sleep, and wake up to draft the bankruptcy papers. It would be over. The struggle to keep the store afloat, the endless math of poverty, the constant grinding anxiety. It could all just end. He opened his eyes. The safe was still there. Arthur grabbed a roll of electrical tape from the bench, roughly wrapped it around his bleeding knuckles, and picked the drill back up. By 1:30 a.m., he had gone through 4 drill bits and 2 cutting wheels. The front of the safe looked like it had been through a war zone. Deep gouges crisscrossed the door, and the hinges were nearly severed, but it remained stubbornly shut. He picked up the 6-foot pry bar. It was a heavy, blackened piece of forged steel he usually used for pulling up old foundation plates. He jammed the flattened end into the narrow grooved gap he had carved between the door and the frame. He planted his boots on the bottom of the safe, grabbed the top of the pry bar with both hands, and threw his entire body weight backward. The bar bent slightly. The iron groaned, a deep, resonant sound like a ship settling against a dock. Arthur gritted his teeth, his muscles burning, veins popping in his neck. He pulled harder, closing his eyes, funneling every ounce of his frustration, his failure, and his anger into the steel bar. Crack! The sound was sharp as a gunshot. The top locking bolt, weakened by the drilling and the intense heat of the fire, sheared clean off. The pry bar slipped, sending Arthur stumbling backward to the floor. He scrambled to his hands and knees, breathing heavily. The heavy warped door of the Mosler safe had popped outward. Just a fraction. Just a single inch. Arthur froze. The smell of burning steel and ozone was suddenly overpowered by something else seeping from the dark 1-inch gap. It was the scent of stale, trapped air, old dust, and something undeniably dry and preserved. He slowly reached out, wrapping his bruised fingers around the edge of the heavy iron door. Arthur braced his boots against the base of the safe, wrapping both hands around the raw, jagged edge of the iron door. The metal was still hot from the grinder, biting into his calloused palms, even through the dirt and grease. He pulled. At first, nothing happened. The heavy door, weighing perhaps 200 pounds on its own, hung stubbornly on the twisted remains of its bottom hinge. He closed his eyes, drew in a ragged breath of metallic air, and threw his entire weight backward. The hinge shrieked. It was a terrible, high-pitched squeal of abused metal tearing away from its housing. A cloud of fine, white powder billowed out from the widening gap, catching in the pale light of the fluorescent tube overhead. Arthur coughed, turning his face away as the heavy iron slab gave way. It swung outward with a deep, grinding thud, finally dropping and slamming onto the concrete floor of the garage. The impact sent a tremor up Arthur's legs. He stood perfectly still. The dust settled slowly, coating his boots in a thin layer of gray. The interior of the safe was a dark, square cavern. The walls were lined with a thick, chalky substance, old asbestos and gypsum fireproofing that had sacrificed itself to protect the center. It had worked, while the outside of the Mosler was a blackened, melted ruin. The inner steel liner was entirely intact. It wasn't warped. It wasn't burned. Arthur stepped closer. He wiped a layer of white soot away from his eyes. Inside the cavity sat 2 stacked steel lock boxes, the kind banks used for wealthy clients' safety deposits. They were painted a drab olive green, completely untouched by the inferno that had destroyed the hotel a decade ago. His heart performed a strange, heavy stutter against his ribs. The cynical voice in his head, the one that had kept him alive but miserable for 40 years, screamed at him to lower his expectations. "It's hotel stationery," the voice said. its old keys, its employee tax records from 1988. He reached in. The top box was heavy, much heavier than paper. He slid it out. The metal was cool to the touch, a shocking contrast to the battered exterior of the main safe. He carried it over to his workbench, clearing a space among the scattered drill bits and spent cutting wheels. He set it down. It locked with a simple brass keyhole. Arthur didn't bother looking for a key. He grabbed a heavy flathead screwdriver and a ball-peen hammer from his pegboard. He wedged the flathead under the lip of the lockbox lid and brought the hammer down hard. Whack, whack. The thin brass lock shattered on the second strike. He dropped the tools. His hands were shaking now. He hated that they were shaking. He pried the lid open. There was no sudden gleam of cinematic treasure. There were no neatly stacked bricks of cash. The box was stuffed tight with small, heavy canvas bags, the heavy-duty kind used by armored car companies, tied off with thick twine. They smelled strongly of canvas, old dust, and machine oil. Arthur reached out and picked up the first bag. It fit in the palm of his hand, but it weighed at least 2 pounds. It shifted with a dull, heavy, clinking sound. It didn't sound like loose change. It didn't sound like quarters or dimes. The acoustic signature was dense, deadened, and deep. He pulled a utility knife from his apron and sliced through the old twine. He inverted the bag over the scarred steel of his workbench. A cascade of dull, yellow-gold discs tumbled out, fanning across the dark metal. Arthur stopped breathing. The garage was entirely silent, save for the hum of the refrigerator in the corner. He stared at the coins. They were large, the size of silver dollars, but they carried the unmistakable, heavy luster of solid gold. He reached out with a trembling, grease-stained finger and pushed one away from the pile. He picked it up. It was absurdly heavy. The face of Liberty stared back at him in perfect, uncirculated relief. The date at the bottom read 1924. Above the eagle on the reverse, the words, United States of America, $20, double eagles. Arthur's mind went blank. The crushing arithmetic of his life, the mortgage, the late fees, the supplier invoices, the foreclosure notices, short-circuited. He looked at the pile on the bench. There were at least 20 coins from that single bag. He looked at the lockbox. There were 8 more bags just like it. And there was a second lockbox still sitting inside the safe. He grabbed the edge of the workbench to steady himself. His knees felt like water. Oh, fake, his brain hissed, desperately trying to protect him from the inevitable fall. They're replicas. Lead plated in cheap gold. A novelty collection. Don't be an idiot, Arthur. Nothing good happens to you. He grabbed a pair of heavy pliers. He took one of the coins, clamped it in the jaws of the pliers, and squeezed. If it were plated lead, the soft metal underneath would dent and deform under the pressure. The jaws slipped off the hard, dense edge of the coin, leaving only a microscopic scratch on the rim. The metal underneath gleamed just as brightly as the surface. It was gold. Arthur dropped the pliers. He stumbled backward, his legs giving out entirely. He hit the concrete floor hard, sitting right in the middle of the mess of iron shavings, broken drill bits, and white ash. He looked up at the ceiling of his terrible, failing garage. He didn't cheer. He didn't scream. He just buried his dirty face in his bloody, taped-up hands, and for the first time since his father died, Arthur wept. It wasn't a cry of joy. It was the violent, physical release of a man who had been drowning for 10 years and finally felt his boots touch solid ground. The morning sun cut through the single, grime-frosted window of the garage, casting a harsh, pale beam across the floor. Arthur hadn't slept. He had spent the remaining hours of darkness meticulously emptying the lockboxes. The final tally sat organized on his workbench, glowing quietly in the dawn light. 240, 1924, St. Gaudens double eagles. Underneath the bags in the second box, he had found something else. Wrapped heavily in oiled cloth and sealed in a vacuum-tight plastic sleeve was a thick, steel sports watch. It had a faded black dial, a strange red and blue bezel, and a crown flanked by pointed guards. Even with his limited knowledge, Arthur recognized the Rolex coronet. The paper tucked behind it, dated 1968, called it a GMT Master. He didn't know what it was worth, but he knew what gold was worth. He had spent an hour on his cracked smartphone, looking up spot prices and historical auction values. Even at scrap value, the gold alone was enough to erase every debt he had. But they weren't scrap. They were pristine. At 8:30 a.m., Arthur washed his face in the slop sink, the cold water shocking his exhausted system. He packed 10 of the coins and the watch into his battered steel thermos, wrapping them carefully in a clean rag to keep them from rattling. The rest he placed back into the lockbox, carried it into his house, and buried it deep beneath the floorboards in his bedroom closet. He drove to the city. He didn't go to Dean's pawn shop. Dean was a scavenger who fed on desperate men. Arthur needed a professional. He parked outside a discreet, heavily fortified storefront in the financial district. Harrison's Numismatics and Estate Jewelry. He pushed through the heavy glass door. A chime echoed through the quiet, climate-controlled room. The air smelled of expensive floor wax and old paper. A man in his late 60s, wearing a gray cardigan and a jeweler's loupe resting on his forehead, looked up from behind a thick glass counter. He assessed Arthur in a single glance. The stained boots, the dark circles under his eyes, the bandaged knuckles. "Can I help you?" Harrison asked, his tone perfectly polite but undeniably guarded. Arthur walked to the counter. He didn't say a word. He unscrewed the cap of his thermos, pulled out the rag, and unrolled it on the velvet display mat resting on the glass. The heavy gold coins clinked softly as they settled. The Rolex sat beside them, a relic of steel and faded color. Harrison stopped breathing. The guarded professionalism vanished, replaced by an intense, almost predatory focus. He pulled the loupe down over his right eye and picked up one of the double eagles. He held it up to the bright halogen display light. He turned it slowly, examining the reeded edge, the mint mark, the strike details on Liberty's face. Silence stretched out in the shop. The only sound was the ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner and the distant, muffled hum of city traffic outside. Harrison set the coin down softly. He didn't look at Arthur. He picked up another one. He checked it just as thoroughly. Then he picked up the watch. He unscrewed the crown, felt the tension of the mainspring, and examined the bezel fading. "Where did you get these?" Harrison finally asked, his voice a low, tight rasp. He still wasn't looking at Arthur. "I bought a box," Arthur said, his voice completely flat. "At an auction." Harrison finally looked up. His eyes were wide behind his glasses. "Are you aware of what you have sitting on my counter, sir?" "Gold," Arthur said. "Yes, but not bullion. These are MS-64 grade, perhaps MS-65. They have never been circulated. They are museum quality." Harrison pointed a trembling finger at the watch. "And this is a 1675 GMT Master with a perfectly faded Pepsi bezel and its original papers. It alone is worth more than the truck you likely drove here in." Arthur just stared at him. "Give me a number. For all of it, not just what's on the counter. I have 230 more of those coins at home." Harrison sat down heavily on his stool. He pulled a calculator toward him, his fingers flying across the keys. He paused, stared at the screen, and then looked back at Arthur. "If the rest are in this condition, I can broker a private sale to collectors. After my commission, you are looking at roughly $580,000, perhaps more." The number hit Arthur like a physical blow to the chest. Over $500,000. The mortgage was $60,000. The store's debt was $40,000. "I can write you an advance check today," Harrison said quickly, misinterpreting Arthur's silence for hesitation. $50,000. To secure the lot. "Right now." "Make it 50," Arthur said, his voice surprisingly steady. "I'll bring the rest tomorrow." An hour later, Arthur walked out of the bank down the street. The cashier's check had cleared. His account was no longer in the red. It was overwhelmingly in the black. He climbed into his rusty pickup truck. He turned the key. The engine rattled to life, the exhaust sputtering. He drove back toward his town. As he approached the main strip, he saw Dean's pawn shop in the distance. The neon sign was buzzing in the midday sun. Arthur slowed down. He looked at the shop. He could pull in. He could walk in there, slap the bank receipt on the glass counter, and watch the smug, cynical grin melt right off Dean's face. He could rub the $90 joke in the man's face until he choked on it. Arthur's foot hovered over the brake pedal. Then he exhaled. A long, deep breath that seemed to carry 10 years of bitterness out of his lungs. He didn't need to prove anything to Dean. He didn't need to prove anything to the men at the auction. They were ghosts to him now. He pressed the accelerator, driving right past the pawn shop, past his failing store, and headed straight toward home, leaving the jokes and the laughter completely behind him. If you loved this incredible journey of grit, discovery, and turning a $90 joke into a life-changing fortune, we need your help to tell more stories just like it. Hit that like button, share this video with someone who loves a great underdog story, and subscribe to the channel right now. Don't forget to ring the bell so you never miss a hidden treasure. What would you do if you cracked that safe? Drop a comment below.